I remember the first Halloween my parents let me trick-or-treat without them. I was 8 years old, dressed in tattered clothes splattered with fake blood, my face painted a sickly gray with darkened eyes and a gash drawn across my cheek. I was a zombie, and for the first time I felt the thrill of being out on Halloween night with no one but my friends, Chris, Johnny, and Trevor. We'd been planning our route for weeks, determined to hit every house in the neighborhood and get as much candy as possible. It was one of those perfect Halloween nights, the kind that only exists in memory, tinged with the orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns and the chill of a crisp autumn breeze. The streets were alive with kids in costumes, shouting and laughing, bags of candy swinging from their arms. We started at the top of Elm Street, sprinting from house to house, yelling, "Trick or treat," at every door. The four of us were unstoppable, our pillowcases gradually getting heavier with each visit. For a while, everything was great. We were having the time of our lives, fueled by sugar and the thrill of being out without adults hovering over us. But then, something stupid happened. I can't even remember what the argument was about. Maybe Chris took too long at a house, or Johnny claimed he saw a full-size candy bar and wouldn't share the address. Petty stuff, really. But when you're 8, those little things feel enormous. I remember yelling something dumb, my voice cracking in frustration. My friends didn't take my side. They shrugged, and Chris made some offhand comment like, "Chill out, man, it's just candy." And that was it. I felt like the odd one out, embarrassed and angry, so I did what any stubborn kid would do. I stormed off. "Fine, I'll go by myself," I said, turning away from them. "You're gonna get lost," Trevor called after me, but I ignored him. I didn't need them, or at least that's what I told myself. I would finish the night alone. I'd show them I didn't need anyone to have a good time. I made my way down the quieter streets, away from the main throng of trick-or-treaters. I stopped at a few houses, still feeling the sting of the argument but distracted by the constant promise of candy. I was determined to fill my pillowcase and head home, triumphant and alone. And then, I saw it. It was a house I hadn't noticed before, set back from the road and nearly hidden behind a line of tall, skeletal trees. But it was impossible to miss now because the decorations were incredible. Gravestones dotted the lawn, some tilted and weather-worn. Ghosts hung from branches, swaying in the breeze, and a giant spider's web stretched across the porch, complete with a furry, oversized arachnid lurking in the corner. Fog rolled from a hidden machine, blanketing the grass in an eerie mist. The house itself was draped in shadows, save for a few flickering orange lights that gave it a haunted glow. I couldn't resist. This was the house that would make my night. I walked up the long driveway, the sound of crunching leaves the only noise around me. My heartbeat quickened with each step. The air was colder here, and for the first time that night I felt a strange sense of unease. But I brushed it off. I was just spooked by the decorations, that's all. I rang the doorbell, listening as the chimes echoed from within. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a couple standing in the dim light of the hallway. They were older, maybe in their late 40s, with friendly smiles and matching sweaters. The woman's hair was pinned back in a neat bun, and the man wore glasses that reflected the light, hiding his eyes. "Well, aren't you just the scariest little zombie I've ever seen?" the woman cooed, her voice sweet and warm. "What a fantastic costume." "Thanks," I mumbled, feeling suddenly shy. "Are you alone, sweetheart?" the man asked, glancing behind me. His voice was soft, but there was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. A hint of worry, maybe. "No," I lied. "My friends are waiting for me." I gestured vaguely behind me where the empty street stretched into darkness. "Oh, that's good," the woman said, smiling. "We wouldn't want you to be out here all by yourself." There was a pause, and I started to feel awkward standing there on the porch, clutching my pillowcase. I was about to turn and leave when the man spoke again. "We've got a special treat for brave trick-or-treaters like you," he said, his smile widening. "But it's just inside. We didn't want it to get stolen, you see." I hesitated. "I'm not supposed to go inside." Of course not, the woman said quickly. "And you're very smart to be cautious, but it's right by the door, just a quick step in, and you can take as much as you like, we promise. Right, Harold?" "Absolutely," the man nodded. "And then you can get back to your friends." I bit my lip, torn between the urge to stay safe and the temptation of whatever they were offering. I glanced back at the street, still empty, and decided that it would only take a second. Besides, they seemed nice, and I didn't want to look like a scared little kid. "Okay," I said finally, "just for a second." As soon as I stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind me with a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to see the woman locking the door, her smile still plastered on her face but now tinged with something I didn't like. "It's right through here," the man said, his hand resting on my shoulder. His grip was firm, guiding me toward a darkened hallway. Before I could protest, before I could say anything, I felt something sharp press into my arm. The world around me spun, the walls blurring, and the last thing I remember before everything went black was the woman's face, staring down at me, her eyes glinting with a twisted kind of joy. When I woke up, I was chained to a cold metal pole in a basement that smelled of mildew and something far worse. My head pounded, and my wrists ached where the cuffs had rubbed the skin raw. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that buzzed overhead, casting long distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The couple, Harold and the woman, who I later heard him call Doris, were standing a few feet away, watching me with expressions that were somewhere between delighted and deranged. They didn't ask me my name, didn't seem to care who I was beyond the fact that I was theirs now. I was their prize, their new plaything. They pretended I was their child, sitting me in front of an old TV and putting on cartoons like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal, not even close. Whenever I tried to speak to ask why they were doing this, Doris would shush me, pressing a finger to her lips and smiling as if she were calming a fussy toddler. And when I wasn't watching TV, they'd tell me how lucky I was, how special it was that they'd found me. But the niceties were just a thin veneer over something far more sinister. Their kindness would twist into something dark, something that made my skin crawl. They would take turns hurting me, though they were careful not to leave any marks that would show. It was never enough to draw blood, but it was enough to leave me trembling, my voice hoarse from screaming into the musty air. Time became meaningless down there. I don't know how long I was chained to that pole, my legs numb from the cold concrete floor. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. At some point they must have left, maybe to go upstairs and pretend they were normal people again. I heard muffled voices through the floorboards, a door opening and closing, the sound of footsteps above me. It was only later that I would learn what had happened. My parents had gone out looking for me when I didn't come home, their fear growing with each passing hour. By morning, they'd filed a missing persons report. Neighbors were questioned and my friends told the police about our fight. The search area widened, but it wasn't until one of the neighbors, a quiet woman who lived across the street from Harold and Doris, called in a tip that the police even thought to check the house with the amazing Halloween decorations. I heard them before I saw them, a chorus of shouts and the splintering sound of wood as the basement door was kicked open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and suddenly, there were officers all around me, their faces horrified as they saw the state I was in. I remember being carried out, wrapped in a blanket, the chill of the night air a welcome sensation after the stifling basement. Harold and Doris were arrested, though I never saw them again after that night. The newspapers called them monsters, and I guess they were right. But they weren't monsters because of how they looked or acted. They were monsters because of the things they hid beneath their pleasant smiles and neatly kept home. It's been years since that Halloween, and I don't talk about it much. My parents tried to help me move on, and for the most part, I've managed to piece my life back together. But I still remember every detail of that night. The way the decorations looked in the moonlight, the sound of the door locking behind me, and the cold, unfeeling concrete of that basement. So, if you're reading this, remember, never trick-or-treat alone, and never ever go inside someone's house no matter how much candy they promise. Some doors, once you step through, are impossible to come back from.
I woke up with a start, heart hammering, the remnants of a bad dream fading in the black void around me. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. I blinked against the darkness, swallowed, and tried to steady my breathing. My room. My bed. I should have felt safe. But something was wrong. It wasn't the usual darkness that enveloped me. This felt thicker, heavier, as if the night itself had seeped into my bones. And the sound. There was a sound, a scratch, or maybe a scrape. Too faint at first, but it was there. My skin prickled with awareness as I strained to listen. Silence swallowed everything around me, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. That half-dream space we drift into after waking, maybe it was just that. Then I heard it again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across something rough. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and turned my head, eyes wide as I scanned the room. The darkness was suffocating, thicker than it had any right to be. My bedside lamp was a useless shape against the wall. The moonlight, usually so comforting, was just a pale glow leaking in through the curtains, not nearly enough to pierce the shadows. And that sound. It came again. Louder this time, closer. The noise seemed to crawl along the walls, slipping under the furniture, wrapping around the corners, like something was dragging itself toward me, unseen but persistent. I didn't want to move. Something inside me, an instinct buried deep, told me to stay still. But I couldn't help it. My body shifted, almost on its own, and my gaze flicked to the ceiling. That's when I saw her. At first I didn't register it, just a vague mass above me, clinging to the ceiling like some horrible shadow that had grown too thick to disperse. But then it shifted, and I made the mistake of blinking. Her eyes opened. Two slits of cold, malevolent light stared down at me from the dark. They gleamed in the dimness, wide and unblinking, fixed on my face with an intensity that felt like a physical pressure. And she was smiling. Her lips stretched impossibly wide, exposing teeth that weren't quite teeth. Too jagged, too long, more like shards of bone crammed into her gums. Her face was gaunt, flesh tight against her skull, and her skin. It wasn't right. It shimmered in the faint light, like it was too thin, almost translucent, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. Her hands were pressed against the ceiling, long skeletal fingers splayed out like the legs of a spider, her nails scraping the plaster in slow, deliberate motions. Scratch, scratch, scratch. My heart stopped in my chest. She wasn't hanging on the ceiling. She was crawling on it, defying every rule of nature, her body twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. Her limbs were all wrong, too long and bent at unnatural angles, like her bones were broken but still working somehow. She moved slow, deliberate, inching along with that horrible scraping sound, her eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. She tilted her head at me, almost playfully, that grotesque smile spreading wider across her face. Her long, matted hair hung down, swaying as she moved closer, her fingers scratching louder, echoing in my ears. Then she stopped, directly above me. I could smell her, like something rotting, mixed with damp earth. Her breath was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt, brushing across my skin like an Arctic wind. I couldn't look away. Those eyes, burning with hate and hunger, bore into me. My body was locked in place, frozen by a fear so primal, so overwhelming, that I thought I might pass out just from the weight of it. The room felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse around me, breathing in and out in time with her movements. Shadows slithered at the edges of my vision, and the darkness pressed closer, suffocating. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, the blood rushing through my veins, but it all seemed distant, disconnected from my body. She was so close now, her cold breath mingling with mine, and I swore I could hear her whispering, though her mouth never moved. Words that weren't words, sounds that made no sense but wormed their way into my skull nonetheless. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything. But I was trapped in that bed, paralyzed by fear. All I could do was stare at her, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The ceiling was empty. The darkness swallowed her whole, and for one brief, agonizing moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. But I was wrong. Because she was there, at the foot of my bed. I didn't hear her move. I didn't see her crawl down from the ceiling. One moment she was above me, the next she was standing at the end of my bed, hunched and looming, her form barely visible in the shadows. Her head was tilted to one side, her smile still stretching wide, too wide, as if her face might split open at any moment. She reached out a hand, those long, crooked fingers stretching toward me, her nails blackened and jagged, and I still couldn't move. She took a step forward, and another. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything. My muscles strained against the weight of the fear pinning me down, but it was no use. I was stuck, trapped in my own body as this thing, this demon, crawled closer. Her body twitched and jerked unnaturally, her movements erratic, like a puppet with tangled strings. Her fingers brushed against my foot. Ice shot through my leg, a cold so intense it burned. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to draw blood, but I couldn't feel it. All I could feel was her touch, spreading up my body like frostbite, numbing everything in its path. Her face hovered above mine again, that hideous grin stretching even wider as she lowered herself over me, pinning me down with her presence. The smell of rot and decay filled my nostrils, thick and nauseating. She whispered again, those strange, nonsensical sounds filling my ears, crawling into my brain. And then, she laughed. It was the sound of something broken, a rasping, guttural noise that shook me to my core. Her laughter echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls, mixing with the steady thud of my heartbeat. She leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear, and I felt her teeth, those sharp, jagged things, just grazing the skin of my neck. "Mine," she whispered. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, she attacked. Her hands wrapped around my throat, cold fingers digging into my skin, and I felt the pressure building, squeezing the air from my lungs. I struggled, my body finally reacting, but it was too late. She was too strong. Her grip tightened, and I could feel her breath, hot and rancid, as she pressed her face against mine. The room spun, dark spots dancing at the edge of my vision. I clawed at her arms, but my fingers slid through her like smoke, as if she wasn't even real, and yet the pain was excruciating. I could hear my own choking sounds, the wet rasp of my breath as she crushed the life out of me. The darkness grew thicker, pulling me under, swallowing me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth hung open, useless, as my vision blurred, my body going limp beneath her weight. Her laughter echoed in my ears, fading as the world tilted, blackness closing in around me. And then, nothing, just darkness and silence.
I've spent my life among the dead. My name is Alexander Green, mortician by trade, and the dead are my constant companions. They're silent, predictable, and obedient, unlike the chaos of the living. My assistants come and go, but the bodies, they remain. Lance was different, though. He was steady, dependable, with a dark sense of humor that made the cold nights in the morgue almost bearable. When he didn't show up one morning, I didn't think much of it. People have their reasons, I told myself. But as the hours dragged on and the day turned to night, worry began to gnaw at me. No one had seen him, and his phone rang endlessly. The absence of his snarky remarks and constant humming to himself left a peculiar emptiness in the air, one that felt heavier than the bodies that surrounded me. That night, alone in the morgue, I was struck by how much the silence had changed. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was suddenly louder, almost mocking. The creak of the metal gurney seemed to echo longer than usual. I tried to focus on my work, embalming a particularly bloated man who had been fished out of the river, but something about the place felt different, like the air itself had thickened with an unseen presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though the room was empty save for the bodies under their white sheets. I often joked that I could feel the dead watching me work, but this was different. Their silent eyes felt accusing. I shrugged it off as lack of sleep and pushed on, but the chill wouldn't leave my bones. It started subtly. The bodies I worked on seemed altered. Little things you could miss if you weren't as obsessive about your work as I am. An arm that was lying one way when I left the room would be angled differently when I returned. A hand that seemed to have curled into a fist. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but I found myself avoiding eye contact with their still faces. The mortuary never felt this alive before. It was on the third day of Lance's disappearance that the unease turned into something sharper, something I couldn't ignore. I was working on a young woman, a recent overdose victim. She was pale, almost blue, her mouth slightly open as if whispering some final lost secret. I could have sworn her eyes were closed when I placed her on the table, but now, under the harsh fluorescent lights, they were open, staring straight at me. I nearly dropped my instruments. Her gaze was unsettling, fixed and unblinking, I approached cautiously, my gloved hands trembling as I reached to close her eyes. They didn't budge. They were locked in a wide, horrified stare, as if she'd seen something beyond the veil, something monstrous. "Calm down, Alexander," I muttered to myself, forcing her eyelids shut, feeling the cold tackiness of her skin. I turned away to wash my hands, but when I glanced back, her eyes were open again. It was impossible. I had shut them. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I tried again, pressing harder, as if she was somehow resisting me. Then I noticed something else, small but unmistakable. Her finger was pointing, slightly bent as if reaching toward something. I hadn't positioned her that way, I was sure of it. My breath hitched as I followed the line of her extended finger. It pointed not at me, but at another covered body across the room, shrouded beneath a stained sheet. Lance's body hadn't turned up, I thought, but the idea whispered in the back of my mind, an unspoken horror I dared not acknowledge. I tore myself away and forced my focus back on my work, but every time I turned around, the dead seemed to shift, subtly reorienting their postures, all angled toward the body beneath the sheet. The mortuary's quiet transformed into a taunting silence, each second stretching unbearably. I had never feared this place before, but now it felt as if the walls were closing in, trapping me among their cold company. A day passed, maybe more. I couldn't tell anymore. My sleep was fractured, disturbed by images of glassy eyes and pale, accusatory hands reaching toward me. I started to dread going back to the morgue. The bodies felt wrong. Their stillness was no longer peaceful. It was anticipatory, like they were waiting for something, or someone. And then came the voices. It started as a faint whisper, a delicate brush against my ears. I was alone. Of course, I was always alone now, but I swear I heard it. Lance's voice. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Alexander, help me." I whipped around, my eyes darting between the motionless forms, the cool gleam of stainless steel, and the stacks of neatly arranged tools. Nothing, just the morgue, as it always was. But the voice lingered, threading itself through the quiet, begging, pleading. I forced myself back to work, but my hands wouldn't stay steady. Each corpse I touched felt warmer than it should, as if some remnant of life clung to their rotting flesh. They seemed to twitch at my touch, though I knew it was impossible. The whispers grew more insistent, voices mingling together, weaving a haunting chorus. "Find him, Alexander. Find him." I backed away from the table, my heart racing. The voices were everywhere now, murmuring from every corner of the room. I stared at the corpse I'd been working on, a frail old man with sunken cheeks, and for a brief, horrific moment his mouth moved. The bodies were all pointing now, unmistakably. Every stiff finger, every glassy eye, every slack jaw angled toward the same place. The covered form in the far corner, the one I had been avoiding. My pulse pounded in my ears, a frantic drumbeat of dread. I moved toward it, compelled by something beyond my control. I reached for the sheet, hesitated, and then, with a shaky breath, pulled it back. The smell hit me first, a pungent stench of rot and decay that sent bile rising in my throat. The body was bloated, the skin mottled and stained. But I knew that face, even in its twisted, ruined state. Lance's dead eyes stared up at me, hollow and accusing. His mouth hung open, frozen mid-scream, as if he had died in unspeakable agony. I stumbled back, my head spinning. How long had he been here? How had I not known? I felt the weight of the dead pressing in around me, suffocating me with their silent stares. The morgue was no longer just a place of work. It was a tomb, and I was trapped inside it. Lance's body was grotesquely positioned, limbs askew as if he had been tossed carelessly. I could see bruises around his throat, deep and dark, his face contorted in a rictus of pain. It was murder, plain and simple. Someone had killed him and hidden him here, among the bodies he used to tend, and yet no one else had access to this place. No one but me. The realization clawed at my mind, tearing at my sanity. The voices were louder now, shouting in a deafening cacophony, their words indistinguishable but filled with rage and sorrow. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but they burrowed deep, filling my thoughts with their anguished cries. I don't remember falling to the floor, but I must have, because I found myself lying there, staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights. The ceiling seemed to bend and twist, the shadows dancing in shapes that shouldn't exist. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to escape the sight of Lance's dead, accusing face. When I opened them again, I wasn't alone. The bodies were standing all around me. I blinked, hoping it was some feverish nightmare, but they remained, their skin pallid, eyes sunken and cold. They loomed over me, surrounding me in a circle of death, their whispers now a unified chant. You did this. I tried to crawl away, but their hands reached out, icy fingers brushing against my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet, but they blocked my path, a wall of the dead closing in. Lance stood among them, his body moving stiffly, joints cracking with each unnatural step. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His eyes, though, said everything. They were filled with accusation, betrayal, and something deeper, something that chilled me to the core. I backed into a corner, my breath hitching in my throat. The dead were everywhere, closing in tighter, their eyes boring into me. I could feel the cold radiating off them, seeping into my bones. Lance was at the front, his face inches from mine, and I could smell the sickly sweet stench of decay on his breath. "Lance, I'm sorry," I choked out, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The bodies seemed to swell in response, their silent anger palpable. And then suddenly they all spoke in unison, a single dreadful voice that echoed through the morgue. "You left him." It was true. I had left him somehow. I couldn't remember it, but the truth was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Lance had died here, alone among the dead, and I had done nothing. The memory came rushing back, a flash of an argument, anger boiling over, hands around a throat. My hands, his struggling, his gasps, his final choking breath. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the horror of it all. The dead pressed closer, their cold hands on my shoulders, my arms, my face. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. The morgue spun around me, the lights flickering as if struggling to stay on. Lance's face loomed over mine, his expression twisted into something almost sympathetic. "You can't hide from us, Alexander," he whispered, his voice like nails on glass. "You belong here now." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the morgue, absorbed into the unending silence of the dead. They closed in, their touch freezing, pulling me into their cold embrace. I could feel the life draining out of me, replaced by the chill of the grave. I was one of them now, another lifeless body among the many. My mind, trapped in eternal screaming darkness, forever condemned to the cold company of the dead.